Hello and welcome to Property Matters. I'm Stephen Galpin and today we're going to be talking about empty properties. Now, I have somebody with me today whose passion is about empty properties, who actually founded a business on that subject. And it is a subject that causes a lot of conversation, especially here in London, when we have so many homeless and unaccommodated people. So I'm going to introduce you to Simon Taylor, founder of Empty Property Hunters Limited. Welcome.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Great stuff. Well, we want to know all about the subject. So the first thing, Simon, how do you identify these properties that are empty? Well, how do you come across them?
Empty homes, Stephen. Well, there are hundreds of thousands of long-term empty homes up and down the country. We work with a community aspect. So the majority of the people that send us in possible leads, properties that they suspect are long-term empty, they're members of the public. It could be a neighbour who's frustrated and upset that a property's fallen into disrepair on their street. Perhaps it's overgrown, there's problems with brickwork, there's maybe foxes in the garden. So we often have members of the public who are concerned about their locality. Quite often the people that identify empty properties and pass them to us to investigate are from all walks of life. It could be binmen, newspaper deliveries, Amazon deliveries, and just people who are perhaps out and about during the course of a working day, or they know of an empty property. They know from a community group, local Facebook group, that people are asking questions about a particular property and where on earth is the owner, and quite often nobody knows anything, which is why they perhaps come to knocking on our door to see what investigations we can do to see if so we can do something with the property.
Okay. I suppose there are two aspects to it really. One is the nuisance factor, as you say. If you've got a very nice, well-kept home, nice garden, all the rest of it, and next door has fallen into utter disrepair, then of course it's not only unsightly, it's actually affecting your values, isn't it?
Well, it's affecting, I think living next door to a long-term empty, derelict property, peeling paint, bad brickwork, abandoned car on the driveway that's perhaps covered in ivy, there's weeds everywhere. It's antisocial in many respects. And if you are living next door to that property and your property is spick and span, perhaps you're a terrace or a semi-detached property, the estate agent who's perhaps doing viewings on your lovely home, the viewers can't help but ask questions about, well, what is happening with that house next door? And it can be quite off-putting. So it ultimately, yes, there is an impact on a property's value if you're living in the vicinity of such a property, in my eyes.
I suppose the other aggravation, I suppose, for people who observe these kind of things is that we've got a huge homeless problem across the country. We've got a shortage of homes, a shortage of houses, which has over the years pushed prices up. And of course, it's very frustrating to then learn that people have bought places, left them empty, perhaps overseas owners that have bought it for, an if and when situation later in their life. I'm not sure about the validity of that argument, but nevertheless, there are a lot of empty properties that could be used for accommodating people.
There is a housing shortage in the UK, unquestionably, and a frustration, and it's probably one of the reasons why Empty Property Hunters exists or came into my life, was the fact that what is happening with these, if we're talking about a housing crisis and we need to build more homes, my view is, well, why aren't we using the houses that we've already got? Fix them up, get them back into use. Maybe some incentives need to be put in place, or penalties on the owners to get these properties lived in and working and playing an active part in the housing stock. There is rarely a week that will go past without, putting on the breakfast news, social media, etc., where we're not talking about housing, cost of living. And of course, it's supply and demand economics, and we need more housing supply. And I get frustrated if we're hearing about building targets and building on the green belt and the brown belt. But why don't we just use great. Use what we have, and I'm trying to shine a spotlight and shout from the rooftops about long-term empty homes, not because there's one or two here or there, but because there's hundreds of thousands. And I'm just trying to bring exposure onto this sector of the market to use what we have. It's recycling, really.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's just talk about the practicalities of your operation for a moment. How do you learn about these properties?
So, the amazing thing of social media is word can get spread, and we have circa 3,000 members of the public up and down the country who know of empty properties in their area, or maybe when they're out and about walking the dog on the way to the shops, or during their course of their business, they're out and about, and they keep their eyes and wits about them, and they very kindly send them in.
Right.
And we then do our investigations on those properties, and we're breaking records every month, but we're at circa 900 to 1,000 empty property leads or suspected empty properties, and the clues might be which I've mentioned: an abandoned car, peeling paint, build up of post, chimney stack that's perhaps looking like it's leaning in the wrong direction, overgrown gardens. There's lots and lots of clues, and people really enjoy. We've got a really active community spirit of people sending in these possible leads for us to investigate.
Okay, I can see how in a street of, shall we say, terraced houses, or just normal semi-detached
Yes.
houses or whatever, they're quite easy to spot. How would you spot the sort of the apartment buildings that often house a number of empty flats?
Well, that's tricky. So, which is why our firm doesn't necessarily focus on flats, and there's no doubt we are maybe missing a trick. There's got to be, if there's thousands, hundreds of thousands of empty homes, a proportion of those must be apartments and flats and blocks. Particularly perhaps in certain areas of London where their overseas owner they've left, but you don't know because the door is closed.
Yeah.
There are no outside space. They're not causing a nuisance to their neighbour. And those ones again are they're there, and nobody, I suppose, knows the exact stats on apartments, but we put it that at around 300,000 long-term empty homes in the UK, we reckon around sort of 15 to 20% of those must be apartments.
Yeah, I mean, I actually live down the road here, and I mean, certainly on my floor, there's, I think, 4 apartments on the floor, and I've been the only occupant there for the last 2 or 3 years. I think the other 3 were empty.
Really?
Yeah. So it happens, and actually, although you say it's not particularly a nuisance, in some respects it is. But
well, listen, we're all human beings. We like a little bit of interaction. If it's just a good morning and how are you, or I picked up a parcel, and
not too much.
Well, no, fair enough. But it's just it's nice to know that there's somebody there.
Sure, yeah. And of course, even in apartments, the maintenance of empty flats is an issue, because if you start to get leaks that go down a floor or whatever else, or smells coming from an apartment because the drains haven't been flushed or used, it can cause quite a lot of
absolutely. There's an issue, particularly for a leak, and we had a case only a few weeks ago where it was a leak was coming in through some missing roof slates, and it was a terraced house, and the cause of the offence was the long-term empty house next door where the roof had seen better days. And the lady who lived next door had reported this property to us to say, listen, I'm at my wit's end. Is there anybody where you can find? And she gave us a few clues as to where the owner may or may not be. And we were able to track them down and have a conversation. But she, frustration and upset had been building for some time, because she's having to deal with this issue on her own, and she's having to declare to her insurance company that there's the leak of it. The origin of this leak is next door, but there's an absentee owner, so it's distressing and frustrating. And in her instance, she's having to pay an additional insurance premium because of that property being empty next door.
Yes, this of course is why building societies often put in a condition of the loan that you'll either have to inform them or somebody of your vacating the property for any period over a couple of months or whatever.
Yes, I think it's normally sort of 30 to 60 days.
Yeah.
If you're absent for that length of time, they need to be notified. Yes, because then they want to flick you onto an empty homes insurance policy,
Sure.
Which is actually, for anybody that's ever inquired about a long-term empty homes insurance premium, it's probably around sort of 3 to 5 times the price of a standard policy.
Yeah,
for understandable reasons.
Which is probably one of the reasons not many people notify their building societies or whatever. But anyway, okay. And again, dealing with the practicalities of what you do, Simon. So, okay, let's just take an example. You find you find an empty house that's getting in a bad state. It's obviously causing a problem. I'm looking at you as perhaps I would call a coordinator. So perhaps you take that empty property, you then perhaps pass it out to a developer or a refurbishment company or an agent that specialises in that kind of property, and you try and get the thing back in use. Now I can see that probably a lot of these properties would require refurbishment and some TLC. How easy is it to get the finance for that kind of refurbishment?
Well, the answer, we are well funded, and it has been quite straightforward. It's an interesting subject, and as long as the bricks and mortar check out, we can get funding, no problem at all. We are sitting on cash reserves from a private equity investment that's been put into the Empty Property Hunters business, which is giving us the firepower to make acquisitions, to negotiate offers, make purchases without the requirement of third-party funding. But we have explored conversations with, should we say, specialist lenders in the world of bridging and development finance. And you're absolutely right. Literally, without any exception, the properties that we are acquiring or wanting to acquire, they all require a full refurbishment top to bottom, all of them. And that's part of the reason I think why people have, the owners have, we say, buried their head in the sand. It's just quite often too much to bear. Too much to think about. It becomes slightly overwhelming, and they just want to, should we say, out of sight, out of mind. And those are the conversations that we try and flush them out of the long grass and see whether there is a conversation to be had about us acquiring the property. But some lenders, if you're going with a standard 10 or 15 to 20% deposit, it might be tougher. Many a lender will say, well, is there a functioning kitchen? Are the utilities all in working order? Is the roof sound? Is it watertight? So those, should we say, less experienced prospective purchasers with smaller reserves might struggle, property dependent. For us, thankfully, the worse the better for us in terms of condition. That's more value that we can add. And our funders have thankfully given us that authority, that go ahead to proceed with acquisitions, no matter what the utilities, the condition of the roof, and the structural impediments there might be.
Okay. Now, again, on the practical side of things, so somebody phones in and says, look, there's a property here that you either might like to look at or could you help us with? How readily available is the ownership information? Now, the reason I ask that question, because we touched briefly on the two different types of properties, the individual house, which is fairly easy to identify, or the apartment block, where there are perhaps a number of flats that are empty that could be put to use. Now, in the flats, you'd probably approach a managing agent who will then turn around and say, sorry, under data protection, I can't give you ownership information, I'm afraid, you know, mind your own business. And I can see that could be very difficult. Is it easier with the private house?
It is easier with a private house, but of course, it's actually, the information as to who owns a particular property, that's publicly available. You can look up at Land Registry, anybody can log in, have a look, type in the postcode, number 3 Acacia Road, who owns that property, and you will be given a name. So let's say the owner is a Mr. John Smith, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Right, well, I don't know how many Mr. and Mrs. Smiths there are in the UK, but so you've got a name, but then what? What do you do? That's where it becomes tricky. And I can't reveal all our, shall we say, secret sauce ingredients, but we've got an expert research team that can more or less go down any rabbit hole that's possible. We will speak to neighbours. We will also try and build a family tree for that owner and say, well, if we can't find the owner, well, maybe there's a relative who might know something. So we maybe look for a partner or a brother, sister, and a child. So we're often building family trees to try and see who might know something. Is there a forwarding address? We're looking on company's house. Maybe they're a director of a company. Maybe that can leave some clues, and we can get in touch with company's house where they're registered or their accountant. We're also, which is quite fascinating for me, and the stories that we come across in a research team are quite amazing. And it's quite often we'll say, well, we know who the owner is. They were married in 1973, but the trail has gone cold. So, okay, well, who did they marry? Let's have a look down that. They might not even be married to them anymore, but they might know something. If that fails, we can often then look, well, who was the witness at their wedding? because that witness who was at their wedding might be a friend that's still in touch with them or a relative. And the other thing we're often doing is, which is quite staggering, our team are often checking, especially if there's been maybe some, if it's a name, a surname from, say, the Caribbean. So we will often be checking passenger lists from ships in the 50s and 60s that have gone from the Caribbean to London to see who was on there. Maybe there was a change in name, what's a maiden name. So it's all weird and wonderful things that we will do. But we can often find somebody, now maybe a neighbour might say, well, they're living in China, or they're living in Hong Kong, or they're living in South Africa. So we're working with our contemporaries, researchers on the ground over there to see if they can point us in some right directions. People always leave clues, right? It could be a relative, it could be a LinkedIn profile, a Facebook profile, a credit card application. There's always clues here and there that people and registering at different addresses. So it's rare that the cold, it sometimes does, goes completely cold, but we're quite often able to have that conversation. And quite often it's a case of, we're not interested, we're saving it for a rainy day. And also quite often it's, actually, we've been thinking about selling, you're right, it's been empty for far too long. Let's have a conversation, let's try and do a deal.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you what sort of reactions do you get when you actually approach these?
Quite often it's a case of, how on earth did you find me? and we explain what we've been able to do, and that alleviates their concerns. It's quite often, this must be quite suspicious. What is this? So, but we know what pacifies people when we're getting in touch, and quite often they're receptive. And it's just a case of having those conversations. And because there are so many of these long-term empty homes up and down the country, yes, our phones are constantly busy.
I suppose I was going to ask you, but you almost answered it anyway in your narrative then. If it's registered, as a lot of overseas owners do, in a limited company perhaps, how do you go on then? But of course, that I suppose that is a company's house search, isn't it?
It is, and if I was perhaps looking, if our business was focused on, should we say, I don't know, penthouse flats in Mayfair, where the companies may be registered in the BVI for tax purposes, and it's all quite secretive, that's going to make our life an awful lot more difficult. But for the type of properties that we tend to focus on, bread and butter, shall we say, 2-bed terrace, 3-bed semis, small detached houses. That's the typical makeup of the UK housing stock where the empty homes are. They don't tend to be held in fancy, sophisticated tax avoidance type structures.
And those kind of people are not going to be very interested in what you've got to offer, are they either, probably?
Probably or possibly not. No. So we're wanting to speak with the owners of, and most of the properties that I described that we look for. Yes, they're held in private ownership by the proverbial Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Mr. and Mrs. Jones, etc., etc.
Okay. And what's the most sort of prevalent reason for these homes being? Yeah, let's talk about the average ones. You're talking about the houses in the street. What's the most obvious reasons that they are empty?
There's a whole host of reasons, and it all boils down to people and human nature. And life can throw so many different curveballs at people. It might be a job that takes them overseas for 6 months or a year, and all of a sudden that 6 months of a year has turned into 5 years or 6 years or 8 years, and they haven't come back to the property since, or maybe they visited once. Maybe it's a death in the family and it's just too traumatic and overwhelming for the relatives to do anything with the property. We've heard instances where it's almost deemed slightly disrespectful to do anything with the property or upset the belongings in the home. It could be a messy divorce, family disputes. So there's a whole host of reasons as to, we've had one instance where the gentleman from the UK had actually emigrated to South Africa. But he always had one view of, well, I don't know whether I'm going to ever need to leave South Africa. I'm a bit concerned about the currency, the South African rand versus the pound. Having this home in England is a little bit like money in the bank, bricks and mortar. I'm going to use it as a currency hedge against the South African rand. It's going to lose me money in renovations when I eventually sell it. It's gone to rack and ruin, but what I lose, I'll make up on the currency gain. But we had a conversation with him and he says, I've been debating this for several years and I'm not getting any younger. I'm a gentleman in my 70s now. I am not coming back to live in the UK. I've got children and grandchildren now. It's time to sell it. So it's a whole host of weird and wonderful reasons.
And I suppose with the length of time probate can take sometimes, that could be another quite significant reason.
Well, the interesting thing is, and sometimes there's probate is done. And you'd think that, well, if there's beneficiaries to the estate post-probate, then they're going to want to sell the asset to realise the cash. But maybe there's 3, 4, 5 siblings. Maybe there's some squabbles. Maybe they're just not emotionally ready to depart or to sell the property. So all of a sudden, quite a case of, that probate was done years ago, but the property's still not been sold. Or quite often there is... the probate hasn't been administered because of a feeling of, oh my goodness, how do I handle this? And it's kicked to the curb or buried under the carpet. It's overwhelming and we have to perhaps step in and obtain beneficiaries' information from a will. So we'll often look at a will and who's administered that, who are the beneficiaries, and we will get in touch with them and they'll perhaps put the pieces of the jigsaw together. And they need their hand-holding through the probate administration process, which we often will help with.
Sounds like your staff become sort of social therapists in some way.
Well, that's property, and the interesting thing, I think the interesting about property is not necessarily the property; it's the human stories behind the structure. Yeah.
Okay. Now, just take one of your typical owners. What are the pluses and minuses of leaving a property empty? What is there any rate relief these days for having a property empty? Are there any pluses? Or?
Are there any pluses? Well, quite often, if it's purposely left empty for long periods of time, there might be some trauma or some stress related to that property, and it's manana, kick the can down the road and I don't have to worry about it. I will worry about it later at some time in the future. That's more common than people realise. Is there any other benefits other than that? Well, would I say wear and tear? Possibly internally. The oven's being used less frequently. The carpets are perhaps less threadbare because they're not being trod on. But externally, your garden's going to go to ruin. And if you don't cut your grass for 5 years, you've got big problems, right? That's a specialist job for a specialist gardener. The cons are, it's going to hit you in your pocket because local authorities have the power now from Westminster to charge levies, to charge premiums for purposely keeping that property empty. And they do checks, and they do get tip-off from members of the public. So some local authorities will charge you double council tax. Some local authorities will charge you triple. So only yesterday, my colleague Austin was dealing with a property in Cambridgeshire where for the last 7 years, the owner has been paying not double, triple council tax for 7 years.
Wow. I was going to say, is this down to each local authority, or is it a nationwide thing?
So each local authority interprets it slightly differently, and some are more lenient than others. Certainly, there's a sort of a scale, but it typically goes from double first year, then triple after 3 years, and triple after 5 years. But it fluctuates from local authority to local authority. But either way, it's hurting you in the pocket. And some would say, well, that's a good thing, and that should be a stick to entice more owners to perhaps sell up their assets. Now, you might say, well, I'm in a flat, and I'm in an apartment, and there's nobody on my floor, and people can do whatever they wish, and I've got no arguments with that. But if you're living next door to a property where there's, as I pointed out earlier, problems structurally with the property or the roof, it's not fair. It's antisocial.
I get that.
Right. And that tends to be the issues that we come across and face.
Okay. Well, look, I think the final and perhaps major point that I want to raise with you, you read both the property press and the normal press, and there's always a lot of fuss, again, particularly here in London, about empty properties and denying people's homes. However, one side of this argument could be a moral one, which says, look, I bought this property, I bought it with tax-paid money, I'm paying my council tax, it's not doing any harm to anybody. What right have you or anybody else got to come along, i.e. the government, and say, we're going to penalise you for not utilising that property? It's my money, my investment, my choice. How would you answer that?
I think you said it there, which is as long as you're not causing any distress or issue to anybody else. So we dealt with a long-term empty property in Swindon, where the garden was so overgrown, hedges, etc., were overhanging onto the pavement. And there was a lovely little girl who I met because we got talking to the family next door when we inspected the property. And this lovely little girl, who must have been 4 or 5 years of age, she says, well, it's cut my face, that property, because when I've been coming around the corner on my scooter, the brambles, which had been overhanging onto the pavement, have scratched my face. I don't think that's fair. So if you have a long-term empty property and you're happy to pay double or triple council tax, go for it. Fill your boots. As long as you're keeping that garden spick and span and you're maintaining that property and you're not causing any nuisance or distress to anybody in the vicinity, I've got no problem with that. But yes, it's when it starts to affect others that because we hear these stories every day from people, we can understand and feel their frustration and stress from having these properties causing a nuisance to their life.
Okay, but just coming back to this moral point again, I mean, the government often mention and say they want to clamp down on particularly overseas owners that leave properties empty just on an investment basis. They could be used for homes, they could be used for,
yes,
you know, solving probably the homeless crisis that we have in some way or another. That's a slightly different issue to, you know, the unpleasantness of, you know, unkempt gardens and things. So what would you say about that? Is there an entitlement to the government to be able to legislate against that, do you think?
I think there should be. I think I'm not going to say I'm not, you know, this isn't communism and it's, you know, use it or lose it.
Right.
But I think there should be some sort of element of do whatever you like, but, you know, by the way, if you keep it empty for 3 or 5 years, you're going to have to pay a penalty. I think that's sane and rational, but I think common sense in many respects has gone out the window. And it was only yesterday that I was reading that Southampton Council, whether they knew about it or not, I don't know, but it's quite common that we come across long-term empty and abandoned homes and we check ownership and it turns out that the property is owned by the local authority. So in Southampton are selling off a number of their properties that they've had empty for years, right, in council housing stock. Despite there being a 5-year wait for a council house in the Southampton area. So there's madness everywhere. So, but I'm just thinking that common sense has surely got to prevail at some point. Councils must be penalised by central government for not using their housing stock. It's unforgivable.
That I would agree with.
Right, and whether you and I are going to agree or disagree on, you know, the capitalist aspect, it's my property, I paid for it, I mind your own business. I think it's more nuanced and there's shades of grey there.
Okay. Well, Simon Taylor, thank you very much for coming in and explaining your passion and your operation.
Thank you for having me.
It's super interesting. I do wish you luck with your endeavours. I think you're doing a great job and you're obviously very thorough in the way that you do it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time on Property Matters.